At 16, I stood outside my parents' grand mansion, clutching a small suitcase that held what little they allowed me to take. The storm above roared like it wanted to swallow me whole, but the cold in my chest was louder. My father, Richard, glared at me with a fury that could strip flesh from bone. His final words rang in my ears like a gavel slamming down, "You are no longer our daughter." With that, he slammed the heavy oak door, and my world shattered. My mother, Evelyn, didn't say a word. She simply stood in the shadows of the entryway, arms crossed, her face blank, as if erasing me required no effort at all. I was 16, pregnant, and abandoned by the two people who should have been my shelter. That night, I was nothing more than a scandal they wanted to erase. I remember pressing a hand to my stomach as the rain soaked through my clothes, whispering to the tiny heartbeat inside me that we would survive this. In that moment, fear and love collided in my chest, forming something stronger than either. It was the birth of defiance, though I didn't realize it then. They thought by casting me out, they had ended my story. What they never understood was that rejection is not an ending. It's the spark of a new beginning. 20 years passed. 2 decades of sweat, tears, and rebuilding from ashes. I raised my son, Daniel, with the same unwavering love I had craved as a child. We built a life from scratch, without their money, without their approval, and without their shadow looming over us. I worked, I studied, I fought, and every milestone Daniel reached was proof that I had succeeded where they had predicted failure. But then, when I thought their absence had finally faded into irrelevance, they returned. Not with apologies. Not with reconciliation. They came back with lawyers, polished lies, and one outrageous demand: custody of my son. The same son they abandoned me with at 16, the same boy they never bothered to acknowledge, the same life they once treated as a stain. They wanted to take him away, to rewrite history and reclaim what they had no hand in building. I stood in that courtroom and looked into their aging faces, and for the first time, I saw fear, not in me, but in them. Because deep down, they knew the truth was about to surface. What happened in that courtroom destroyed everything they thought they had built: their image, their legacy, and the power they believed they still held. Before I reveal how karma unfolded and how the walls of their empire came crashing down, I need you to do something for me. Hit that hype button right below this video. Think of it as a super like. You get 3 hypes each week, and each one helps push this story higher so more people can hear it. And while you're here, tap like, share, and subscribe so you never miss the next tale where karma reminds the world that no secret stays buried forever. Because what came next was the reckoning they never saw coming. My name is Jane, and I'm 36 years old. If you met me today, you would see a woman who raised her son alone, who carved out a life without a safety net, who learned the hard way that strength is not given. It's built brick by brick from the rubble of broken trust. But I wasn't always like this. To understand how I got here, you need to know who I was at 16, before the storm hit, when I still believed my family's approval was the air I breathed. At 16, I was the kind of girl who lived in books. I memorized lines of poetry, scribbled essays late into the night, and dreamed of becoming a teacher. My room was filled with stacks of library novels because imagination was the only place I felt seen. Outwardly, I was obedient, polite, never the one to cause scandal. But inside, I was starving, not for food or clothes, because my family had plenty, but for warmth, for affection, for even a single moment where my parents looked at me with pride. My father, Richard, valued achievement only when it polished his own image. My mother, Evelyn, lived for appearances, for the admiration of neighbors, for her seat at church socials where gossip was currency. And in their world, my older brother Henry was the shining star. He could stumble through life, barely passing his classes, yet he was showered with applause as if mediocrity in him was brilliance. When he brought home trophies, no matter how small, they were displayed in glass cases. When I earned top marks in school, my papers ended up in the trash. Living in Henry's shadow was like being invisible. I learned to swallow my victories quietly because no one cared to notice them. At family dinners, my parents' voices rose with excitement when Henry spoke about his day, while mine barely registered. Even my attempts at kindness, helping my mother with chores, listening to my father's endless lectures, were dismissed as duties, never as signs of love. That was my childhood, being present, but never mattering. Then came the turning point, the secret I carried alone at first. At 16, when I realized I was pregnant, fear wrapped around me like iron chains. I was terrified of what it meant, of what my parents would say, of how the world would look at me. Yet even in the midst of that fear, something else stirred. A fierce, unshakable attachment. I placed my hand on my stomach and felt an invisible bond stronger than anything I had ever experienced. For the first time, I wasn't completely alone. I was carrying someone who belonged to me, someone who didn't require me to prove my worth or compete with Henry's spotlight. It was strange how quickly that bond turned into courage. Each time I imagined my child's face, I imagined a life where love was not conditional. That thought gave me strength I never knew I had. Even before Daniel entered the world, he gave me a reason to fight for something better than the cold halls of my parents' mansion. He became my anchor, my secret source of power, the promise that no matter what storms were coming, I would endure them, for him. That bond saved me when everything else crumbled. I grew up in a house that looked like perfection from the outside. Our mansion stood tall on a hill, polished marble floors, wide staircases that echoed every footstep, chandeliers hanging like frozen waterfalls. To visitors, it was the picture of elegance. But to me, it was a cage. The walls held more rules than warmth, and every dinner felt like a courtroom. We sat at a long table, silverware perfectly aligned, yet the silence was suffocating. My father's gaze was always sharp, my mother's smile always rehearsed, and my words, when I dared to speak, were brushed aside like background noise. My father, Richard, lived for legacy. To him, every action was weighed not by kindness but by how it would look to others. He carried himself like a king, his voice booming when he spoke of family honor, his lectures filled with warnings about failure and disgrace. He loved control more than he ever loved me. My mother, Evelyn, was his shadow. She smiled for neighbors, for church gatherings, for the charity luncheons where she liked to be admired. But inside the house, her smile disappeared. Her silence cut deeper than my father's shouting. She was always present but never present for me. Then there was Henry, my older brother, the golden child. He could do no wrong. If he came home late, excuses were made. If his grades slipped, they blamed the teacher. When he succeeded in something small, it was celebrated like the world's greatest triumph. He wore the crown of favoritism, and I wore the weight of invisibility. It wasn't just favoritism, it was protection. He was shielded from every consequence, while I was held accountable for everything, even things I hadn't done. Not everyone in my life reflected that coldness. Aunt Margaret, my father's sister, was gentle in ways no one else in the family dared to be. She never spoke against Richard openly, but in private, she'd slip me notes of encouragement or bring me a small book she thought I'd like. Her gestures were quiet, but they told me I wasn't completely unseen. And then there was Sophie, my best friend. Sophie was the one who stayed after my parents disowned me, who came with blankets and food when I had nothing. Where my family closed their doors, Sophie opened hers. The contrast between worlds was sharp. I had grown up in marble halls where chandeliers sparkled but affection was absent. Later, when I lived in my first tiny rented room, the paint peeled from the walls, the floorboards creaked, and the window let in the cold. But in that room, I felt something the mansion never gave me: freedom. It was mine. No judgment, no cold stares, no rules carved into my skin. Just me and my son, Daniel, building life from scraps but filling it with a warmth I had never known as a child. That difference, between a house filled with appearances and a home filled with love, defined the battle I was destined to fight. From as far back as I can remember, I lived in Henry's shadow. He was the golden boy, the one paraded in front of relatives, the one whose smallest victories were celebrated as if they were world records. Meanwhile, I became invisible. When I earned top marks at school, the report card barely got a glance before it was tossed aside. When I won a writing competition, it was dismissed as just a hobby. But if Henry managed to tie his shoelaces without stumbling, the whole family treated it like a miracle. Family gatherings became rehearsals of humiliation. I would sit quietly at the dinner table while uncles and aunts praised Henry's latest so-called achievements. My own name was barely mentioned, And when it was usually accompanied by a warning. My father, Richard, often cut me down with words like a whip. He called me ordinary, a term that stung more than any insult because it stripped me of any uniqueness I thought I had. My mother, Evelyn, was no better. She would lean close before family parties and whisper warnings not to embarrass them, as if my very presence was a threat to their reputation. These moments piled up like invisible scars. One humiliation bled into the next. I learned to lower my voice, to shrink my presence, to hide my joy in case it drew criticism. I stopped expecting praise because I knew it would never come. Every small act of cruelty, every dismissal, every subtle jab stacked on top of the other until the weight on my shoulders became unbearable. Then came the day I revealed my pregnancy. I can still hear the sharp intake of breath, the silence that followed before my father's voice exploded in the room. He shouted disgrace, his face twisted with fury, his eyes narrowing like I was filth in his perfect house. My mother didn't even try to defend me. She looked away, her hands folded tightly as if she could squeeze the scandal out of existence by ignoring it. That silence cut deeper than his anger. That night marked the heaviest brick laid on the pile, the one that made the whole structure collapse. I realized their love was conditional, and I had broken the one condition they valued most, protecting their reputation. Each act of mistreatment had prepared me for that moment, but nothing could soften the blow. It was then I understood that in their eyes, I was not a daughter, not a person, but a blemish they could discard. The night everything changed was carved into my memory with cruel precision. A storm raged outside, wind howling through the trees, rain lashing against the windows of the mansion where I had spent my entire life. But instead of shelter, I found rejection. Richard stood in the doorway, his jaw tight, his voice cutting like a blade. He shoved a small suitcase into my hands, barely packed with a few clothes and essentials, and with eyes full of contempt, he spat the words that would haunt me for years: "You are no longer our daughter." With one motion, the heavy oak door slammed shut, echoing like a final judgment. Behind him, Evelyn stood in the hallway, watching. She didn't argue, didn't cry, didn't reach for me. Instead, she quietly closed the curtains as if by doing so, she could erase me from existence. In that instant, I understood. My mother had chosen silence over love, and silence can wound more than anger ever could. I was 16, belly heavy with life, and utterly alone in the storm. I remember standing on that porch, soaked to the skin, clutching my stomach as the wind cut through me. Then, amidst the chaos of rain and thunder, I felt it, Daniel's tiny kick from inside me. That gentle tap, so small yet so powerful, was my reminder that I wasn't truly abandoned. Someone needed me. Someone belonged to me. And unlike my parents, I would never turn my back on him. In that moment, shame turned into fire. Their rejection no longer defined me, it freed me. I whispered through trembling lips a vow I would carry for the rest of my life: "You will never grow up in their shadow. You will never beg for scraps of love. You will know kindness, even if I have to build it from nothing." That night was supposed to be my undoing. But standing there in the storm, suitcase at my feet, heart breaking and yet burning, I realized it was the beginning. The mansion behind me, with all its cold rules and silent judgments, had never been a home. But the child inside me, he was my home. From that moment, I decided I would raise him without their cruelty, even if it meant walking through fire to do so. The rejection became clarity, as though a heavy curtain was torn from my eyes. For years, I had bent myself into shapes I thought would please them. Silence when I wanted to speak, obedience when I longed to resist, restraint when love begged me to leap. But in that moment, standing outside their gates, belly small yet carrying a life that would one day call me mother, I knew the begging was over. No more waiting for scraps of approval, no more mistaking control for love. My whisper to my unborn child was not just comfort, it was a vow: that's their life, not ours. Not anymore. It was the first boundary I ever drew, and it saved me. With that vow, a strange strength settled in. I had no money, no safety net, no certainty of tomorrow. Yet for the first time, I had a sense of direction. Not toward their acceptance, but toward building something of my own. Rejection, I discovered, is not always a wall. Sometimes it is a compass pointing you away from where you were never meant to stay. That realization gave me the clarity to stop rehearsing the endless what ifs. What if they forgave me? What if they invited me back? What if they finally saw my worth? None of it mattered. I wasn't going back. When I look back, I see that breaking point as the birthplace of resilience. Many people think strength comes from standing tall in victory, but often it comes from collapsing, crying, and then rising again with resolve. My collapse outside those gates wasn't weakness, it was my womb of transformation. And here's what I learned: every person will meet a breaking point. For some, it's losing a job. For others, a marriage ending, a diagnosis, or being told you're not enough. That moment either crushes you or cleanses you. If you choose the latter, it becomes fuel. To anyone listening, I would say, when you hit that breaking point, don't run from it. Don't drown it in distractions or silence it with shallow comforts. Face it, name it, and let it guide you. The pain you feel is evidence of growth demanding to happen. Rejection is often the universe's redirection. Approval may feel like oxygen, but self-belief is the air that truly sustains you. That night, I wiped my tears, adjusted my bag, and walked away. I was still trembling, still scared, but no longer chained. That was the paradox of rejection. It broke me, but in breaking me, it set me free. I worked nights at a small diner, the kind where the neon sign flickered and the scent of coffee clung to every corner. My hands were raw from scrubbing dishes and carrying trays, but in those breaks between shifts, I cracked open textbooks under the dim light. I studied while balancing exhaustion, whispering encouragement to myself as I held Daniel close, his tiny breaths reminding me why I couldn't give up. That diner became more than a workplace. It was my classroom, my proving ground, my altar of sacrifice. When I rented my first apartment, it was barely more than a showbox. Peeling paint, a leaky faucet, a single window that looked out onto a brick wall, but it was ours. For the first time, I had a key that wasn't borrowed, a door no one could slam in my face, a space where I could laugh and cry freely. Every squeak of the floorboards carried a sense of victory. I wasn't just surviving, I was building. Each paycheck stretched further than I thought possible. Groceries first, because I refused to let Daniel know hunger. Baby clothes second, because dignity begins even in infancy. Later, books, brightly colored at first, then heavier ones for myself. Those purchases were small but sacred, proof that I was investing in a future not yet visible. There's a unique pride that comes from watching your child take their first steps on a floor you fought for, in a home no one else provided. Daniel's first stumble into my arms was more than a milestone. It was confirmation that my sacrifices were blooming into joy. The promotions came slowly, but they came. From waitress to shift supervisor, from night worker to someone trusted with keys. Each step felt like reclaiming pieces of dignity once stripped away. With discipline, I saved enough for a used car, rusted, unreliable at first, but it gave me mobility. No longer dependent on others, I could drive Daniel to daycare, drive myself to better opportunities, and drive away from the shadows of my past. Of course, Richard and Evelyn weren't silent. They sent messages through relatives, subtle and sharp like arrows wrapped in paper. Some were veiled with guilt, they regret what happened. Others were baited with status, you could still come back. But by then, I had built something their money couldn't buy, self-respect. I let their words fall unanswered, because silence can be the loudest declaration of freedom. What I discovered is this: bold action isn't glamorous. It's not about grand gestures. It's about showing up tired, still working, still learning, still believing. It's about saying no to what broke you and yes to the slow grind of growth. And in that grind, you transform, not just into someone stronger, but into someone free. Years later, the image of perfection my parents had so carefully polished began to fracture under its own weight. Henry, the golden son who once could do no wrong, was revealed as deeply flawed. Gambling tables had swallowed his inheritance, and risky business ventures became sinkholes of debt. The empire built to glorify him turned to dust. His laughter, once paraded as charm, echoed now as recklessness in the hushed corners of society gossip. The same relatives who once scorned me began to whisper about him, their tones thick with disbelief. How could Henry, of all people, fall so far? Richard, my father, had staked the mansion, the very home that had been my prison and then my exile, as collateral to shield Henry's failures. That house of marble and chandeliers became nothing more than a pawn ticket in the hands of creditors. I heard the whispers before the headlines. The perfect family, once untouchable, was drowning quietly, gasping beneath the weight of their own illusions. The irony was undeniable. While they had cast me out to protect their reputation, it was reputation itself that betrayed them in the end. It was Aunt Margaret who came to me, one of the few relatives who had always slipped me kindness in small, hidden ways. She spoke softly, as though even distance could not sever her fear of my parents' wrath. She told me of Evelyn's secret regrets, nights when my mother sat alone, staring at old photographs, wondering if she had been too harsh. But regret is not the same as apology. Regret is safe, it costs nothing, asks for no humility, and hides behind silence. Apologies require courage, and that was something Evelyn never offered. Hearing those words stirred something strange in me, not triumph, not gloating, but a sober reminder. The walls of their world were cracking at the same time mine had finally steadied. Daniel was thriving, I had advanced in my work, and our small apartment radiated warmth their mansion never held. I realized then that stability is not found in marble floors or inherited wealth. Stability is built on choices, daily, deliberate, and often invisible. For a long time, I wondered if I should confront them, if I should demand acknowledgement or offer forgiveness. But life had already answered the question. I had healed without their apology. Their collapse was not my revenge but their consequence. And my growth was not my defense but my destiny. The lesson I carried, and share now, is simple. When others build castles on illusions, don't envy them. Build your own foundation on truth, no matter how small the bricks may seem. Because truth, unlike marble, does not crumble. Out of desperation, my parents resurfaced, no longer draped in the aura of untouchable power. But instead of coming with open arms or softened hearts, they arrived armed with lawyers and paper weapons. Their petition for custody of Daniel wasn't just a legal move, it was an assault on the very foundation I had built. In their eyes, reclaiming Daniel wasn't about love. It was about control, about rewriting a history where they had cast me aside. They claimed I was unfit, parading polished lies as truth, as though a courtroom could erase the years of sacrifice that shaped me into both mother and provider. The day of the hearing, the courtroom buzzed with tension. Their side entered with designer suits, sharpened arguments, and the entitlement of people convinced their wealth could sway any outcome. I entered with trembling hands but a steady soul, holding on to the knowledge that while they wielded money, I carried something stronger, truth. Daniel's life, our home, our story, stood as living evidence that their narrative was a facade. Aunt Margaret became my unexpected anchor. She stepped forward, her voice carrying the weight of decades of silence. For the first time, someone from within their walls spoke aloud what had always been hidden. The neglect, the cruelty, the coldness behind the polished image. She told the court about the night I was abandoned, about the years of reputation valued over love. Her testimony cracked open their carefully constructed mask. For once, their lies didn't stand unchallenged. The contrast was undeniable. On one side, a collapsing empire, a family devouring itself with secrets, debts, and pride. On the other, me, a woman who had clawed her way through exhaustion to stability, whose child had never gone hungry, whose apartment, though small, was filled with warmth. I wasn't perfect, but perfection was never the goal. I was present, steady, and resilient. And that steadiness carried more weight than any inheritance. Karma doesn't always arrive with trumpets or thunder. Sometimes it walks quietly into a courtroom and lets the truth speak louder than wealth. Their attempt to strip me of Daniel only exposed their desperation and their downfall. My parents had thought power would always protect them. But in that room, it was their own history that betrayed them. The lesson is this: when life tempts you to despair at injustice, remember that truth has a long memory. Lies may win applause for a season, but karma keeps its own ledger. And when the time is right, that ledger is balanced, often in the very place your enemies thought they would win. The judge's gavel struck, and with it, the weight of years lifted. The ruling was clear: Daniel would remain with me. In that instant, the air in the courtroom shifted. For them, it was defeat. For me, it was freedom confirmed by law. My hands trembled as Daniel rushed forward, his small arms wrapping tightly around my waist. He whispered against my ear, "We won." His words weren't just about a legal battle. They were a declaration that our bond had triumphed against every attempt to sever it. As I held him, I understood something deeper. I had never truly needed Richard or Evelyn's approval. For so long, I had chased their acknowledgement like a thirsty traveler seeking water in a mirage. Yet, standing there, victorious without them, I realized their acceptance had always been hollow currency. Approval cannot sustain love, cannot feed a child, cannot keep the lights on at night. What I had built with Daniel was far richer than their validation could ever have been. In the quiet that followed, I began to see the shape of my real family. It wasn't bound by bloodlines but by choice. Aunt Margaret, who had risked her standing to speak the truth. Sophie, my friend who offered late-night rides and encouragement when exhaustion nearly swallowed me. And Daniel, whose laughter had been my anchor when despair knocked hardest. This chosen family stitched together what abandonment had torn apart. They didn't demand perfection, they didn't measure me against illusions. They loved me in the rawness of who I was. Healing came slowly, like dawn breaking after a long night. The scars of abandonment didn't vanish, but they began to soften. Where shame once lived, there was now dignity. Where fear had rooted, there grew resilience. I began to understand that healing isn't forgetting, it's reclaiming the power that pain once stole. Every rejection I endured became the soil where transformation took root. To anyone carrying the sting of abandonment, I say this: scars do not make you unworthy. They are reminders of battles survived, of strength you didn't know you had until life demanded it. Approval from others may feel sweet for a moment, but true freedom is found when you stop begging for it and start building without it. As Daniel held my hand that day, walking out of the courtroom, I no longer felt like the girl cast aside at 16. I was a woman who had turned rejection into clarity, struggle into stability, and pain into love. That was my transformation, not perfection, but wholeness. Richard and Evelyn returned once more, but this time without their armies of lawyers or the armor of wealth. Their words were stripped of arrogance, softened by desperation. We only wanted the best. It was a plea wrapped in excuses, a rewrite of history meant to paint their cruelty as misguided love. For years, those words would have pierced me, stirred up confusion, maybe even a flicker of longing. But not anymore. I had walked too many nights alone, held Daniel through too many storms, and built too much strength to fall for fragile justifications. I met their eyes with a calm I had earned the hard way. No raised voice, no bitterness dripping from my tongue. Just steady truth. Respect first, or nothing at all. That sentence was more than a boundary, it was a line carved in stone. I was no longer the frightened girl pleading for approval. I was the woman who had built her own table, her own home, her own life. And at my table, respect was the price of entry. The shift in power was unmistakable. These were the same people who once held my future in their hands, who cast me out as if I were disposable. Now, they stood small before me, their authority crumbled, their legacy tarnished. They had tried to break me with rejection, with silence, with legal battles. But instead of shattering, I had grown unshakable. They no longer inspired fear, they evoked clarity. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to them. They were reacting to me. In that moment, I understood something profound. Reckoning doesn't always come in grand gestures of revenge. Sometimes it arrives in silence, in composure, in the ability to look directly at those who hurt you and feel no tremor of fear. Power shifts when you no longer crave what they withhold. I didn't need their love, their wealth, or their approval. All I required was respect, and if they couldn't give that, they had no place in my life. For anyone who has been diminished by family, let this truth settle deep. You can honor your story without honoring the people who tried to distort it. You can acknowledge your roots without letting them choke your growth. Respect is not optional, it is the foundation of any bond worth keeping. As I turned away from Richard and Evelyn that day, I felt no hatred, only freedom. Their hold on me was gone. They were powerless, and I was no longer afraid. The reckoning wasn't theirs alone, it was mine. And in reclaiming my voice, I reclaimed my life. Looking back, I see now what I couldn't understand in those early days. Rejection wasn't the end of me, it was the beginning. What felt like abandonment had, in truth, been liberation. If Richard and Evelyn had embraced me out of duty or pride, I might have remained in their gilded cage, forever shrinking myself to earn slivers of approval. Instead, being cast out forced me to stand on my own feet, to discover strength I didn't know I had, and to build a life not defined by their expectations. Rejection, in its harsh disguise, gave me freedom. Over time, Richard and Evelyn became shadows of a past I no longer feared. Their power, once so suffocating, dissolved into irrelevance. The world they worshipped, status, appearances, perfection, crumbled, while mine grew richer in ways money could never measure. I did not need to curse them or celebrate their decline. Indifference became the loudest victory. To live well, without their presence defining me, was the clearest proof that their control had ended. Daniel, my anchor through every storm, blossomed in that freedom too. He thrived not because life was easy, but because he witnessed resilience lived out daily. He grew confident, proud, and unashamed of our beginnings. His laughter filled the small spaces we once called home, turning them into palaces of joy. His curiosity and determination mirrored my own battles for survival, and I saw in him the proof that cycles can break, that love, when steady and unconditional, rewrites the story. The greatest transformation wasn't just survival, but release. I no longer carried the weight of trying to change what could not be changed. Richard and Evelyn's choices were theirs. Their regrets belonged to them. I chose not to inherit their bitterness. Walking away wasn't running, it was reclaiming. It was the conscious decision to stop letting their shadows define my sunlight. Together, Daniel and I moved forward, hand in hand. We built new traditions, new dreams, and a life filled with people who valued us not for appearances but for truth. With Aunt Margaret and Sophie as part of our chosen circle, our family became something authentic, stitched together by loyalty and love instead of obligation. And so, we never looked back. Not out of anger, but because the horizon ahead was too wide, too bright, too full of possibility. Rejection had once felt like ruin, but it was, in the end, the doorway to freedom. And freedom became the foundation of everything that followed. The lesson I carry, and the one I leave with you, is this. The best revenge is not destruction, not shouting "I told you so," and not waiting for your enemies to crumble. The best revenge is building a life so full, so steady, so radiant that their absence barely registers. It's living better without them. When people wrong you, they expect your bitterness to keep you tethered to their story. But when you choose joy, peace, and growth, you quietly sever their control. You show them, and yourself, that they no longer matter. Revenge built on rage burns out. But revenge built on thriving endures. My parents once believed that by rejecting me, they had broken me. They believed their silence, their lies, their attempts to erase me would leave me powerless. Yet the truth is simple. It was their rejection that forced me to discover my strength. And today, I do not need their apologies, their wealth, or their recognition. My life stands as proof that their grip has ended, and my freedom has begun. This is where your story and mine meet. Maybe you faced rejection from family, betrayal from friends, or judgment from people who thought they could define your worth. Maybe you're still carrying scars that ache in silence. Hear this. Your scars are not a weakness. They are evidence of survival. And if you choose, they can become the very foundation of your transformation. You don't have to seek revenge in their downfall. You can find it in your own rising. So ask yourself, what would living better look like for you? Maybe it's pursuing that dream they said you couldn't achieve. Maybe it's surrounding yourself with people who see your worth without conditions. Maybe it's walking away from toxic ties and choosing peace over approval. Whatever it is, the real victory is when their absence no longer wounds you, when your joy no longer depends on their presence. If this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you that resilience is possible even in the darkest chapters, then don't let it end here. Tap the hype button. It tells YouTube that stories like this matter, that truth deserves to be heard. And while you're here, like this video, share it with someone who needs courage today, and subscribe to Epic Karma Tale. Because every story you support fuels the next one. Together, we can prove that karma isn't just about payback, it's about transformation. And your support makes that transformation echo louder than ever.